March 1971. A temporary fire support base designated on military tactical maps as LZ Lolo, hacked brutally and blindly out of the mountain spine along Route 9, just inside the rugged neutral border of Laos, during Operation Lam Son 7/19. The sky above this remote outpost is an oppressive, swirling vortex of red dust, pulverized shale, and thick chemical exhaust from hovering troop transport helicopters. The ambient temperature has reached a sweltering 96 degrees Fahrenheit, but inside the narrow sandbagged trenches, the stagnant air feels like oil-filled steam. A sudden, terrifying barrage of Soviet-made 122mm rockets slams directly into the perimeter ammunition dump, triggering a cataclysmic chain reaction that showers the base with white-hot shrapnel and fragments of burning wooden crates. Within seconds, a platoon of weary paratroopers throws themselves face down into the dirt, their hands desperately covering their ears, their teeth grinding against the heavy grit filling their mouths. This is happening every single hour of every single day, without a single second of reprieve. Every single hour, somewhere along the devastated border corridors, where the American-backed forces are facing a massive, overwhelming conventional counteroffensive, young boys are being caught in steel downpours that shred the ancient forest to pieces. The American advisors and South Vietnamese troops are rapidly running out of tactical options. Their escape routes are completely clogged with burning vehicles, and the medical evacuation helicopters are being blown out of the sky by anti-aircraft artillery before their landing skids can even graze the red clay of the landing zone. To understand the agonizing psychological weight hidden inside that battered piece of plastic, you first need to understand that the true, uncensored history of the Vietnam War was never written by the official military photographers or the high-salaried network correspondents who arrived on clean helicopters with pristine equipment. The real war was recorded in small, microscopic fractions of a second by the ordinary grunts themselves. It was captured on cheap, consumer-grade cameras that were smuggled into the bush in the absolute bottom of heavy canvas rucksacks, tucked away beneath spare socks, insect repellent, and sea ration tins. It is a story about a fragile, everyday object, a simple plastic Kodak Instamatic camera, and the terrifying power of a photographic negative to lock a ghost in place forever. It is a story about the raw, unfiltered memories that a man will deliberately bury in the dark, because he is completely terrified of looking at the faces of the dead staring back at him through a chemical print. And that story begins not in the burning, dust-choked trenches of Laos in March, but a year earlier in the neat, orderly rows of an Eastman Kodak manufacturing plant in Rochester, New York, and later on a sun-baked supply dock at Da Nang. The soldier who carried this hidden lens wasn't a professional photojournalist looking for a Pulitzer Prize or a dramatic front-page layout for Life magazine. He was a 20-year-old draftee from the industrial river flats of Evansville, Indiana, a boy who had spent his youth working the assembly lines of a local refrigerator factory, a quiet young man who spent his spare time sketching winter landscapes and adjusting the focus on his father's old stereoscope. His name was Kenneth Logan. And before his tour of duty is concluded, he will not receive a medal for cinematic bravery, nor will his name be etched into the official logs of military heroes. He will simply take one final picture in the middle of an inferno, and he will spend the next 40 years of his life keeping a single, jammed roll of color film, locked away in a dark drawer, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what will happen to his mind if he allows those images to be exposed to the light of day. Before the United States military handed him a green utility uniform and an M16 rifle, Kenny Logan's entire universe was defined by the steady, predictable hum of stamping presses and the gray, slow-moving waters of the Ohio River. He was a boy born with an innate eye for detail, a quiet observer in a town that valued muscle and volume over observation. His father was a tool and die maker whose eyes were permanently bloodshot from the glare of precision grinders. His mother worked the counters of a local pharmacy, sorting small glass bottles into cardboard bins. Kenny learned early that life was lived in the small, silent spaces between major events. He loved the quiet architecture of old barns. He loved the precise way the early morning frost captured the intricate veins of a fallen maple leaf. His father used to tell him, standing at the kitchen table while the winter rain beat against the aluminum siding, "Kenny, a man who looks too fast misses the whole point of the world. The world don't show its truth to the loud talkers. It shows it to the fellow who can stand perfectly still and wait for the dust to settle. If you can remember what a thing looked like before it was broken, you can survive just about anything." Kenny carried that heavy, artistic discipline directly into the selective service system. When his draft notice arrived in the summer of 1970, he didn't protest or try to run north across the border. He simply packed his pocket knife, kissed his mother on the cheek, and bought a cheap, plastic Kodak Instamatic 104 camera at the corner store, determined to document the strange, terrifying world he was about to enter. The Kodak Instamatic was the ultimate emblem of American consumer simplicity. It was a small, lightweight box of black and gray molded plastic that cost less than $16 at any drugstore back home. It used a simple drop-in 126 film cartridge that eliminated the need to thread delicate film rolls in the pitch dark. And it utilized a disposable, four-sided flash cube that rotated automatically every time the user advanced the film lever with a sharp plastic clack. In the official marketing brochures, it was advertised as the camera that anyone could use to capture family picnics, summer vacations, and happy holiday memories. But in the humid, mud-slicked valleys of South Vietnam, the Instamatic underwent a dark, unauthorized evolution. Thousands of young draftees carried them into the bush, wrapping the plastic casings in green electrician's tape to prevent the bright chrome trim from reflecting the tropical sun into the optics of an enemy sniper. They carried them in their grease-stained rucksacks, protecting them from the daily monsoons by sealing them inside clear plastic bags meant for holding dry ammunition. Kenny wore his camera in a small canvas pouch hooked to his utility belt, the plastic box rattling against his aluminum canteen with every step he took through the sharp elephant grass. It became his personal shield against the overwhelming madness of the war, a desperate way to place a small, square frame between his own eyes and the raw, unyielding brutality of the conflict. By the time Kenny's unit, Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, 101st Airborne Division, was deployed along the demilitarized zone in late 1970, the little plastic camera had already captured a secret, intimate history of the platoon that the military bureaucracy would never record in its files. Kenny didn't take pictures of generals visiting the base camp in clean uniforms. He didn't photograph the neat rows of artillery pieces or the propaganda displays designed for the politicians back in Washington. He took pictures of the real war. He captured the tired, hollowed-out smile of his squad leader, Corporal Russo, sitting on an empty ammunition crate with a lit cigarette dangling from his lip, his eyes staring blankly at a mud-stained letter from home. He photographed Gomez, a big 19-year-old kid from Chicago, laughing hysterically while trying to shave his face with cold swamp water using the reflection of a polished combat knife blade. He He captured the surreal beauty of the jungle before the fire came. The massive, ancient banyan trees dripping with silver morning dew, the deep purple orchids blooming out of the rotting bark of a fallen cedar, and the soft, white mountain mist rolling over the ridges like a silent ocean tide. But, as the winter turned into the blood-soaked spring of 1971, the images on Kenny's film rolls grew steadily darker, tracking the physical and psychological decay of the platoon with a terrifying precision. He photographed a small thatch-roofed village that had been completely vaporized by a misplaced napalm strike, the ground still smoking with a greasy, black carbon residue. The skeletal remains of the palm trees standing against the white sky like charcoal fingers. He captured the face of Doc O'Brien, the 19-year-old conscientious objector medic from Oregon, his hands encrusted with dark, drying blood, his uniform torn to rags, as he sat in the mud after a 4-hour firefight, his face completely frozen in the hollow, unblinking stare of combat trauma. Kenny became an obsessive collector of these fractions of time. Every time his camera lens clicked, he felt a strange, desperate sense of relief, as if by locking the image inside the plastic cartridge, he was somehow preventing the memory from burning a permanent hole through his own brain. He was saving them. He was keeping them alive in the dark emulsion of the film, holding them safe from the destruction that was consuming everything around them. The physical reality of trying to preserve a consumer electronic device in the middle of a Southeast Asian conflict was a war in itself. The intense, ever-present humidity of the northern provinces acted like an acid, slowly corroding the delicate internal copper springs and clouding the cheap glass elements of the fixed lens with a thin web-like layer of fungal growth. The fine, powdery red dust of the helicopter landing zones penetrated the plastic seams, threatening to scratch the delicate celluloid surface of the film strip every time the winding lever was advanced. Kenny spent hours in his bunker, cleaning the casing with a worn toothbrush dipped in weapon oil, blowing into the viewfinder to clear the gray grit of exploded artillery rounds. The camera became a living thing to him, a fragile repository of truth that had to be kept alive at all costs, an alternative ledger to the clinical, sanitized casualty reports sent down from Saigon. On the morning of March 12th, during the chaotic, disastrous retreat from LZ Lolo in Laos, the illusion of safety shattered completely and permanently. Charlie Company had been completely surrounded by a massive regular force of the NVA, their defensive perimeter squeezed down to a 60-yard circle of pulverized dirt and burning timber logs. The air was a solid wall of concussive sound, the deafening, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of heavy anti-aircraft guns being used horizontally to chew through the American dirt shelters, the high-pitched shriek of incoming rockets, and the raw, guttural screams of men dying in the open mud. Kenny Logan was crouching in a shallow, collapsed trench, his rifle jammed by the fine red clay, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violent, terrifying force that made his vision blur. Next to him in the ditch was his closest friend in the platoon, a 20-year-old paratrooper from the concrete blocks of Brooklyn named Bobby Reynolds. Bobby was the life of the squad, a fast-talking, reckless kid who kept a harmonica in his pocket and could mimic the voices of the drill sergeants so perfectly it could lift the blackest mood in a bunker. But now, Bobby was lying on his side in the red mud, his legs pinned beneath a shattered timber log, his chest heaving in short, wet gasps. A piece of mortar shrapnel had torn through his flak jacket, turning his utility shirt into a dark, spreading pool of crimson that stained the clay beneath him. Doc O'Brien, the medic, was already dead 20 yards down the line. his medical bag scattered across the concertina wire. There was no one coming to save them, and the incoming fire was cutting the tree canopy to shreds above their heads. Kenny, listen to me, man," Bobby whispered. His voice cracked from dust and the taste of blood, his fingers clawing at Kenny's sleeve with a desperate, fading strength that tore the fabric. "You got that camera on you? The little plastic box?" Kenny nodded, his tears mixing with the black soot on his cheeks as he pulled the tape-wrapped Instamatic from its canvas pouch. "Yeah, Bobby, I got it. It's right here." Bobby managed a tiny, wet smile that sent a line of blood dripping down his chin. "Take a picture of me, Kenny, right now. Take one for the folks back in New York. You show 'em I didn't hide in the hole. You tell 'em I was right here with the boys." Kenny raised the cheap plastic camera to his eye, his hands shaking so violently the lens rattled against the rim of his steel helmet. Through the square plastic viewfinder, he didn't see a heroic warrior posing for a military poster. He saw his best friend dying in a ditch of red clay, the gray mountain smoke drifting across his pale face, his eyes wide and bloodshot, looking directly into the glass lens, with a terrifying mix of pride and absolute, raw terror. Kenny advanced the film lever, clack, and forced his trembling finger down onto the small plastic shutter button. Click. In that single, microscopic fraction of a second, the light from the Laotian sky bounced off Bobby Reynolds' face, traveled through the cheap plastic lens, and burned an indelible image into the dark silver halide crystals of the film cartridge. A second later, a heavy 122mm rocket slammed directly into the ridge behind their trench. The massive concussion wave, lifting Kenny off his feet and throwing him violently against the rock wall. The camera flew from his hand, tumbling through the dirt, the brass casings, and the debris, before landing in a deep, water-filled crater, 20 feet away. Kenny lay in the mud for what felt like hours, his ears ringing with a high-pitched, deafening, static scream, his mouth filled with the bitter taste of sulfur, ash, and blood. When he finally regained consciousness, the smoke was clearing, and the extraction helicopters were making one final, desperate run into the burning perimeter to haul the remaining survivors out of the meat grinder. Kenny crawled through the mud on his hands and knees, his body aching from the blast, and found his camera half buried in the wet red clay near the edge of the crater. The plastic housing was cracked. The winding mechanism was jammed solid by the grit of the explosion, but the film cartridge inside remained sealed in its dark chamber. He slid the broken camera into his pocket, stumbled onto the skids of a moving chopper, and left the body of Bobby Reynolds behind in the Laotian dirt. The flight back across the border was a blur of gray Sung Mu and the low, heavy vibration of the rotor blades. Kenny sat on the floor of the helicopter, surrounded by wounded men who were staring at their boots in silence. His fingers locked around the cracked plastic body of the camera inside his pocket. He could feel the fine Laotian clay grinding between his skin and the plastic casing. He felt an overwhelming urge to pull the cartridge out, to throw it into the sky, to rid himself of the responsibility of holding that final terrifying look in his friend's eyes. But he didn't do it. He kept it hidden, wrapped in a sweat-soaked handkerchief, a secret passenger on his journey away from the front line. For the final 3 months of his tour of duty, through the long, draining patrols and the constant fear of mortar attacks, Kenny Logan carried that smashed plastic camera in the absolute bonafantness rucksack. He didn't try to force the winding lever. He didn't try to open the housing to rescue the film cartridge inside. He knew that if he opened it in the jungle light, the film would be ruined, the images washed out by the glare of the sun. But more importantly, As the days turned into weeks and the physical exhaustion took hold, a deep, paralyzing terror began to take root in the center of his chest. He realized with a terrifying clarity that the last frame on that roll of film was the face of a boy who had been vaporized. Minutes after the shutter clicked, he realized that inside that small plastic box sat a collection of ghosts. The smiles of boys who were now lying in silver zipper bags or scattered across the ridges of Laos, their faces preserved in a state of permanent, youthful innocence, while their bodies turned to dust. When he finally boarded the Freedom Bird back to the States in the autumn of 1971, Kenny didn't celebrate, drink, or join the other soldiers cheering in the aisles. He sat in a window seat, his hand buried deep in his jacket pocket, his fingers tracing the cracked plastic edge of the Instamatic, while the commercial jet lifted off the tarmac of Tan Son Nhut Airport and climbed into the gray clouds. He returned to Evansville, Indiana, but the quiet river town felt like a completely foreign country that he no longer had a AUS passport for. He went back to work at the refrigerator factory, taking the grueling night shift from midnight to dawn, because the heavy, rhythmic roar of the industrial machinery was the only sound loud enough to drown out the silent, terrifying images that played in his head every time he closed his eyes. The townspeople didn't ask him about the war. They were too uncomfortable with the long, drawn-out failure on the evening news, too eager to look away from the hollowed-out look in his eyes when he walked down Main Street. The transition to civilian life was a slow, agonizing process of emotional isolation. Kenny watched his old high school friends talk about corporate promotions, baseball scores, and mortgage rates, their voices sounding like a distant, distorted radio frequency. They moved through a world of clean lines and predictable hours, entirely unaware of the red clay that seemed to cover everything Kenny looked at. As the years scrolled by, the world around him began to undergo a rapid, terrifying technological evolution that Kenny felt entirely unequipped to handle. In the late 1970s and 1980s, the rise of commercial color laboratories and instant Polaroid photography transformed the way America consumed its own memories. Everywhere Kenny looked, people were snapping pictures, instantly prying the chemical squares from their cameras, laughing as the blurry colors resolved into sharp, smiling faces under the warm Midwestern sun. To Kenny, this casual obsession with light and preservation felt like a profound, unnatural betrayal of the boys he had left behind in the dark. Sahoy Hyundai was moving too fast, generating millions of glossy, disposable images every single day, completely erasing the historical dirt of the jungle from the collective memory of the nation. By the time the late 1990s and early 2000s arrived, the digital revolution arrived with a cold, pixelated vengeance. The introduction of digital cameras and early mobile phone optics meant that pictures no longer required a physical chemical process to exist. They were no longer bound to the heavy, material reality of a silver halide strip locked in a sealed plastic chamber. They were weightless, infinite, and entirely hollow. Kenny watched his younger co-workers at the factory swap compact memory cards, scrolling through hundreds of flawless digital files on glowing liquid crystal screens, deleting images of their children or their vacations with a casual, thoughtless flick of a plastic button. It sickened him to his absolute core. He realized that the modern world had engineered a way to look at everything without ever actually seeing anything at all. It had created a culture where memory had no weight, no cost, and no consequence. He would stand in the break room of the factory, his hands caked in grease and gunmetal gray paint, listening to them complain about low battery life or blurred resolution, while his own mind was permanently locked inside a square plastic viewfinder, staring at a 19-year-old boy from Brooklyn, whose life had cost exactly one fraction of a second to destroy. He realized that he had become a documentarian of an alternate reality, a custodian of a dark physical archive that no one in America wanted to open. By the time the 2010s arrived, his hair had turned a premature silver, matching the gray zinc coating of the factory roofs. For 40 years, the broken Kodak camera sat in the absolute back of an old cedar chest in his bedroom, hidden beneath his faded utility uniforms, his silver dog tags, and his old military documents. His family noticed that he carried a strange, unbreakable phobia that seemed to govern his entire life. He completely refused to allow any photographs to be taken of him. If his sister brought a camera to a family Thanksgiving dinner, Kenny would immediately get up from the table without a word, walk out of the house, and sit in his truck in the dark until the vice was put away. He couldn't explain to them the absolute terror that a camera caused him. He couldn't tell them that to him. A camera wasn't a tool for saving memories. It was a trap that locked a soul in a state of permanent death. Every year on the 12th of March, the anniversary of the disaster at LZ Lolo, Kenny would lock himself in his room, pull down the heavy shades, and open the old cedar chest. He would pull out the tape-wrapped Kodak Instamatic, its plastic shell still caked with a thin, dry crust of 40-year-old Laotian clay. He would sit at his table under the light of a single bare bulb, holding the broken camera in his calloused, trembling palms, his thumb running over the jammed winding lever that had frozen at frame 12. He had been tempted 1,000 times to take the camera to a professional laboratory, to have the film developed, to finally see the faces of Russo, Gomez, and Bobby Reynolds one last time. But every time his hand reached for the truck keys, the sheer, paralyzing terror would strike his heart like a physical blow. He was terrified that if he saw Bobby's face looking back at him through a glossy paper print, the fragile barricade he had built around his sanity for 40 years would completely collapse into dust. He wanted to keep them in the dark. He wanted to keep them safe from the light of a world that had completely forgotten their sacrifice. He would sit there until the sun came up, a silent guardian of a dark chamber filled with the spirits of 19-year-old boys who never got the chance to grow old. He carried that camera with him until his own eyesight began to fail, his hands growing too stiff to open the cedar chest, a slow-motion casualty of an old war that had frozen his timeline in the mud of Laos. The official military histories would publish grand, multi-volume books about the strategic movements of Operation Lam Son 719, detailing truck counts, ammunition tonnages, and helicopter loss ratios calculated down to the last digit by computers in Washington. The generals would receive their shiny, distinguished service medals, and would write their lucrative memoirs about tactical containment, geopolitical stability, and the honor of the uniform. The veterans of Vietnam knew the bureaucracy would simply wait for them to die of their wounds caused by Agent Orange or their own broken hearts before acknowledging the raw, unpolished truth of what happened in those ravines. But the truth didn't require a marble wall in Washington, D.C., or a speech by a politician to exist. It didn't care about who won the battle or who abandoned the firebase. It existed in the permanent plastic ledger of a 20-year-old's survival. It existed in the dark, undeveloped silver crystals of a jammed film cartridge hidden inside a broken camera, a silent monument to a circle of friends that only one old man was left to remember in the dark. It was a history that could never be redacted or spun into a victory speech, preserved in the darkness of a cedar chest, while the world moved on into the digital age. If you had been in Kenny's position after that war, would you have developed that roll of film to see the faces of your friends one last time? Or would you have left them in the dark chamber where the conflict found them? Does a photograph carry the soul and the final breath of the person it captures? Or is it just a collection of chemicals on a plastic strip? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more raw stories that peel back the myths of military glory to find the human heart, underneath, make sure to hit subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and let's discover history together.